In this lecture, we'll look at the creative economy of China, and towards the end, we'll make a couple comments comparing it with the creative economy of United States. So, what we'll do in this lecture here is we'll focus on the post-industrial times in China, post-industrial economy of China, and we will look at three components of the creative economy in China, largely based off of Richard Florida's work on the creative class, which is underpinned with what he calls as the 3 T's. We'll look at that. And using that framework, we'll try to understand how China's creative economy is distributed, how has it grown, how is it performing in different parts, and try to get some understanding. What we will not do in this particular lecture, but it will happen outside, is really look at some examples of, for example, the special economic zones and the kind of work that is happening in special economic zones. That will not be discussed in this lecture here at this time. And at the end, we'll also look at what are the implications of all these observations around the creative economy in terms of expectations go forward, right? So that's sort of the context for this lecture here. But before we jump into the creative economy discussions, let's look at a bit of historical context of what has happened with China's growth, right? So China has gone through staged reform, economic reform, from about ideally 1970. There was one attempt that happened in the 1950s to 70s around economic restructuring, but that was still largely socialist in nature, and that was treated as a failed attempt that did not produce significant economic benefits in terms of growth rates or GDP or investment, so on and so forth, right? But the real economic reform began somewhere around the late 1970s, and the goal there was to really turn China's economy into something that's going to be market-driven, based on pricing and investments coming from outside, and reducing the involvement of state, which is the national sort of government, when it came to allocating economic resources. Because like we know, China's economy and China's government is more centrally controlled, contrary to what we see here in the United States, right? So the first stage of reform was to reduce the role of state when it came to distribution of resources to different industries, and so on and so forth, and let it be more market-driven. Phase 2 of the reform, so this particular thing was split into 3 steps, right? Then with first focus on agricultural sector and getting this market-driven reform happening in the agricultural sector. The second one focused on reducing the state involvement, and the third stage was then to say how can we attract more foreign direct investment and really open up the market for sort of global participation in the economy. So those were 3 steps, but the goal was, like I said, the one that is stated above. Now, what were the results of these staged development or reform activities that happened? Clearly, between 1978 to up until like 2010 or so, and even more recently, this has led to significant growth and development that has happened in China. World Bank, which kind of looks across all different countries, agreed that the growth pattern that has been observed in China can be thought of as being capital intensive and industry led versus state led growth, right? That's very different. So World Bank kind of testified and agreed that that's what is really happening here now. China also became an industrial sort of giant in this process, to the extent that the manufacturing output that it generated is second to what is being produced in the US, for example, right? So it has grown its industrial output, and industrial productivity also has gone up during this time. So it's sort of gone through a rapid industrialization kind of a phase over a much shortened period as compared to what happened in the Western world. The third thing is in terms of the overall growth, economic growth. Between 2001 to 2010, China has grown at about 15% per year in this time frame, so which has been really rapid growth even at this time. And to the extent that now it is the second largest economy worldwide and has surpassed Japan as well. So clearly the staged reform activities, almost everybody, all economists universally agree that has led to these economic results that we are seeing. And I think the big thing is reduced state involvement in this entire process that is happening and more foreign direct investment coming in. Now, while those numbers are good, if you take a look at where this growth has happened, so if you take an economic geography perspective of the development that we just talked about, this map kind of visualizes that very clearly. And now China is divided into 31 provincial level sort of provinces and municipalities, and they're kind of managed through the provinces and municipalities, right? So if you look at the breakdown of the growth by provinces, what you see here is a pattern that is emerging. You see the darker shades represent higher growth and higher sort of economic activity that has happened. So clearly the coastal regions are the ones where there is greatest sort of benefit that has come about in terms of economic activity. So it's GDP per capita is what is represented here, and if you take other measurement approaches, if you look at workforce and all that, the graphs tend to be very similar. So a lot of activity on the coasts, economic activity, and also from north to south. If you go to the western regions, the ones in light yellow color, what you find is that those provinces actually can be thought of still as emerging economies. The GDP growth rate over there, the employment, unemployment, the industries, they're still highly agricultural economies in that part of the country. So the growth has been extremely uneven geographically, and it's spread out, right? That's something that we just make an observation at this point. And all this information is coming off of a 2014 report by Martin Prosperity Institute that did the study for creative economy of China. So then, if you, keeping that backdrop in mind, if you look at the creative economy of China and try to understand what has happened in the more recent times. So we look at the post-industrial kind of era in the more recent times. Richard Florida takes the approach of creative class, and Richard Florida, who is also a part of the Martin Prosperity Institute, argues that essentially creative activities happen where there is a creative workforce, so there is talent, and this creative workforce is attracted to those regions which demonstrate a high level of tolerance to diversity of all kinds, so places of diversity and inclusion, and where there are high levels of technology. That's the premise. So creative class concept is founded on the notion that creative talent is attracted to these places where there is tolerance and where there is high technology presence. So if we take those three T's into account and explore China's creative economy with those three T's, we'll look at some observations that we can find from here, right? So first of all, before we look at the results of that measurement, let's see how they're measured, right? So the technology component of this, when we say there is high technology, how is that measured? There is a TechPol index that is formulated, which is thought of as the concentration of high-tech employment in a region and the number of patents that are produced in that region. So if both these numbers are high, it means that it is a high technology place geographically. If you look at the talent, what you're really looking at is the percentage of creative workforce as a percentage of the entire workforce. And by creative workforce, we are looking at sort of the similar job codes that we saw in some of the previous lectures: authors, designers, musicians, so on and so forth, right? So if you look at all these workers, what is their percentage as compared to the total workforce in the region? And third index, tolerance, which is measured as through a Bohemian index, which measures the diversity. There's also an open door index, which talks about how much foreign investment is attracted into the region. So there are 2 or 3 different indices that are put together to come up with an overall measure of tolerance, again, in a geographical context here, right? So if you take these 3 T's, you go back and create a map of China and the provinces. So the 3 T's are measured by provinces again, and we're trying to depict here what is the creative class, where does it reside. Observation is similar to the previous one. The largest part of creative economy is happening along the coast, and again top to bottom, north to south, and there is least on the western side. So it kind of mirrors the creative activity. Creative economy mirrors the general economic growth. The only thing what you find here is the western side, western provinces actually rank high on tolerance. So if you break this down by the individual 3 T's, you will find that the western region is higher on tolerance as well, has greater diversity there. But again, the creative economy is concentrated in certain parts, and in fact, Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin show the highest part of creative economy, and the contribution of creative economy to the local GDP is actually equivalent to that of developed countries around the world. So Beijing, you will find that the contribution of GDP is in the range of 4 to 5%, similar to what you find in the United States. And if you look at the rate of growth of creative economy of these 3, Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin, that is again, the growth rate is high. It's in the 30% range, similar to what you find again in, say, New York, for that matter. So there are parts of the creative economy that are rapidly growing and mirror the developed world. And then there are parts here that actually are mirroring the creative economy of emerging countries. That phenomena is right here. So what does this mean then, if that's what is happening as far as the creative economy is concerned? It's uneven distribution of creative assets. Now, does it mean that, again, this study did not take into account what we saw in the United States creative economy study, which was sort of grassroots, that each state is looking at the creative assets of the state and trying to build on it. What we are seeing here is the ultimate output of creativity, and it still appears that it's a very nationalistic approach to thinking about the creative economy, and the policies that have been put in place have resulted in an uneven distribution of the creative assets in the region, right? So that's an important observation which has implications for future, for inclusive sustainable development. Again, the measurement itself show variations, like we said. If you break them down by the 3 T's, they show variations by the provinces that occur. China's economy is certainly driven by open door and foreign investment and technological development, which actually has led to a lot of industrial-based economy, as we saw in the reform. And the fact that in order to transition this to service economy, more steps need to be put in place so that there is smooth transition into the service-based and creative class economy. And that's why what we are seeing is that the distribution is not even. So the places where the industrial economy and the reform happened the largest, that's where you're seeing the creative economy come in. So the fact is that the approach to foster service-based economies in other regions have to be unique and different than what has happened so far. Most creative assets are along the East Coast. The northern regions are open and have diverse cultures, the northwest regions. But the fact is there is less talent that exists over there. So specific policies probably need to be put in place for those areas. And I think the key thing that stands out in this conversation is that China is trying to promote creative economy and use creative economy for rapid growth. In these regions where it is happening, it's really high growth rates of the creative economy. And that's what happened even in their economic reform. Unlike what we are seeing in the Western world, where the growth of creative economy is not fast and sort of, with rapid up and down. It's been steady, slow, but there is constant growth and more evenly distributed growth. Unlike that, what we are seeing here in China is that it is fast and limited in certain areas. So that clearly has implication. If China has to think about creative economy as a core for sustainable development, inclusive and sustainable development, probably some things may have to change over here. Now, we haven't still looked at the special economic zones, which we will do in a different lecture, but it'll be interesting to see how special economic zones are distributed across the country and if they are able to address some of the issues that have been highlighted in this study, right? That's an open question for now.